Part of what I want to deconstruct is what people call the secularization thesis, but it's going to come to be bigger than that. Now, the secularization thesis, which was common in sociology a couple of decades ago, was roughly speaking that modernization brings about secularization. I mean, modernization is something that was broken down into a series of different developments that we're all familiar with: economic growth, industrialization, higher education levels, science and technology, social and geographical mobility, urbanization, globalization, mass communication. You could go on in this list, and the different variants of the thesis, of course, picked up different features of this list, but roughly developments in this area were thought to have brought about in the West secularization. Decline of belief in practice in the West is undeniable, though very unequally between societies, very much more in some society, very much less in the other. But what I want to take as a target is the explanation of this in terms of these various forms of modernization. Now, why this is important, I hope will also, I mean, it's not just a kind of scholarly, abstract discussion about history, what happened in history, because when you unpack this, you see that a great many assumptions about religion, spiritual life, and so on are built into this thesis. Deconstructing that, you also get a new take on what the religion is like today. I mean, what the spiritual options are today. So all these things ride on understanding properly what came about in the last few centuries. I want to do this, though, by taking a step back, and this by looking at this particular thesis as embedded in something much more powerful and more pervasive, which are what I want to call master narratives. I think people always tend to understand themselves in terms of some big scale narrative. The only remedy for a bad, oversimple, not reflected master narrative is a better, more complicated, more elaborated, and consciously expressed master narrative. We can't really get away without them. And if you listen to people around you, you can see that people are, even in the vocabulary they use, they're using terms that don't make sense outside of a master narrative. For instance, some idea can be condemned as medieval, positively medieval, or another idea can be praised as progressive, or some figure, perhaps some figure we're writing about in the past, can be praised as being ahead of her time. The kind of master narrative that I want to point to, which crystallizes in the 18th century, and with major figures like, for instance, of the Scottish Enlightenment, like the two Adams, Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, with the idea that human history can be understood in terms of stages. The important definition of the stage came in terms of the way people produced the means to life. I mean, as hunter-gatherers, agriculture, commercial, and so on. This could just as easily be a kind of, as it were, upheld by a Weberian thesis that it took some kind of cultural change. In Weber's case, took some kind of cultural and religious change in order to launch modern capitalism, right? So it isn't connected with some causal thesis, but it is connected with what I would call a kind of bundle thesis, that you can't have the important, interesting institutional changes, like a new way of making a living for human beings, without certain cultural changes. That you couldn't have, for instance, modern capitalism without a certain kind of individualism. You couldn't have modern capitalism without a certain kind of work ethic, which in this case is founded on some relationship to the original Protestant view. This, as a theory, is part of the unthought, and it has catastrophic consequences when you start to look outside the European case, because what it does is it canonizes a certain constellation which did indeed go together, certain cultural changes and certain economic changes in the European case, or in some of the European cases, and it imagines that this kind of thing is always going to be happening in any other case where the same institutional and practice changes come about. And that, of course, just isn't the case. As a matter of fact, when you begin to break down even the Western case into sub-cases, into different national and regional and cultural itineraries and trajectories, you see that already very simple elision of certain elements of modern culture and certain kinds of economic development won't work. But this is a very powerful idea. They say what's needed in these other places is they have to get a notion of individualism and the importance of education and the importance of production, and drop all that other stuff, and then they'll be able to go through the proper courses. But of course, that's not the way it really works. I mean, to give a sense of how much that isn't the way it can work, look at something like Indian democracy. We always say India is the greatest, the biggest, the most extensive democratic society, and in some sense this is certainly true. I mean, it's maintained, Dalian polyarchy, representative institutions, you actually can turn over the government, it happens from time to time. But the way in which mass democracy has come to India, connected in many cases with the mobilization around caste or groups of castes and so on, is so out of whack with what people understood as the development of democracy in the West and its rising at the same time as individualism and so on. In a certain sense, it's exactly like Westminster. It's exactly like Canada, because it's Westminster system in a federal structure. There's tremendous analogies between the Indian constitution and ours, but the way in which the thing actually functions, the way in which political mobilization actually takes place, is tremendously different. And its difference, as it were, reflects the quite different context out of which it grows.